Okay. So, 1 Samuel chapter 22. In the last couple chapters, we were reading about how David is being separated from all of the kind of natural and physical supports that he has in his life, all of the people that he counts on, whether it be his wife or Jonathan or his family, and how the Lord is seemingly really getting him in a place where he is alone and where he is by himself and where he is not able to depend on anything except for the Lord. And so we read last week about David fleeing to Gath, fleeing to the enemy country, fleeing to the Philistines in order to have refuge from his own king, and how when he arrived there, they realized who he was and how he pretended to be a madman among them in order to not seem to be a threat. And I would say that between that and what we're going to be reading about today, David has basically hit his low point. This is the place in which he is going to be, writing psalms, crying out to the Lord, and the places where he's really truly learning to depend on the Lord for his very life. So when we ended last week, we ended with the king of Gath saying, "Do I lack madmen that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?" So we're going to begin chapter 22 after a prayer, kind of seeing how the Lord starts building David back up into leadership. The Lord, just pray that you would be with us in this time of study tonight, that you would guide our hearts and our minds as we learn your word, that it would build us up in our faith, that the knowing of your word would just really truly create a foundation for who we are in life, how we make decisions, and how we look at the world, how we approach others, and how we evangelize to the world about your good news, about the gospel. Amen. Okay, so David, chapter 22, verse 1, departed from there. So he left the city of Gath, where he was acting as a madman, and he escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and all of his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. So it's kind of funny that David is headed to this cave to hide and to be in a place where he is truly alone. I think there's maybe different kinds of people in life where when you've really hit rock bottom and you are in a season of just wanting to just feel bummed out, sometimes you want to be alone and sometimes you want to have other people around you. I think it kind of maybe depends on who you are as a person. But personally, sometimes when I am just super bummed out, I just want to be alone for a while to just deal with my bummed outness and just do it the right way, right? And interestingly, David is at this place, this cave of Adullam, the cave of refuge. And, it seems like he maybe kind of wanted to just be there and be bummed out between him and the Lord for a little while. He has lost his position. He has lost his household. He's lost his wife. He's lost his family, seemingly. And he's really at risk of losing his life at this point. He's lost the relationship that he had with this king that it says that he grew to love. And so it's interesting. I don't know in this case how his father and brothers heard about where he was, because he was clearly at this cave in order to hide from King Saul, who was trying to kill him. So my guess would be that he goes through his period of being bummed out by himself and maybe sees a traveler going past or in some way sends somebody to his father and brothers to let them know where he's at. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't have known where to come and find him. So his fathers and his brothers and everyone who is in distress, in debt, and bitter in soul, or I like to change that to discontent because it's fun to have the 3 Ds there, distressed, in debt, and discontent, they all gathered to him. So David's family at this point would have been in danger for their lives as well. I think almost certainly would have been part of King Saul's plan to either take out any potential competition in the person of David's family, or to take them and use them in order to get David to come out of hiding, basically using them as hostages. Like, if you don't come give yourself up, I'm going to kill your family, right? So they clearly cannot stay at home. And it's going to happen somewhere in this intervening time that the Philistines are actually going to take the city of Bethlehem, which is where David grew up. And David is going to have to go and fight the Philistines in order to get Bethlehem back from the Philistines. So for various reasons, David's brothers in his father's house are not able to stay where they are anymore, and they go down to David at this cave. And everyone who was in distress and in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him. So David is seemingly a magnet for people who are on the outs with the king. In this day, if you put yourself or got in the position of being in severe debt, what typically is going to happen is that you are either going to have to sell yourself or your children into slavery for a period of time. And pretty much your other option beyond that is to just flee from your debtors. So there are people who are in distress, people who are in debt, who can no longer live in normal society, and anyone who was bitter in soul or just discontent with their circumstances in life. It could be people who were actually opposed to having a king and who were, people who were basically just discontent with the government that they lived under or their circumstances. They all gathered to David. Now, in the position of being kind of miserable and just bummed out about life, it would kind of stink to have a whole group of people in your cave with you who are all also bummed out about life, right? I don't think there was probably a whole lot of encouraging happening at this point. They were all sitting around the campfire, in the smoky cave, talking about how terrible things are and about how just out of control things have gotten. And it seems that kind of pushed David into a position where he knew that he had to step up and lead. It says that he became a commander over them, and there were about 400 men with him. So what I think is really fascinating is these 400 men are going to become the core of the most effective and deadly army that Israel has ever seen. And I think it's interesting that they are not soldiers. I mean, some of them may have been, but it doesn't say they're soldiers or mercenaries or fighters or bodyguards or mighty men, although they will become such. So David steps up and becomes a commander over these men. And the next thing that we're going to see them doing is going to war. So obviously David, who, from a few years before this point has been a leader of the whole army or of thousands. He is a man who has been trained in warfare and a man who has trained other people in warfare. So these guys, when there's 400 people together, they're in a place that they can't plant, they can't reap, they can't make themselves a garden. They can probably go and, steal sheep or whatever, but pretty much their option to have food is to go and raid and fight against the enemies of Israel. So David is putting them together in a group, probably training them, becoming an example to them. I really doubt that he came out and said, hey guys, I was anointed by Samuel to be king over Israel, so you should really listen to me. I don't think he did that. But evidently his strength of character and his reputation with the people were enough to where they all come together to him and he becomes their leader. So he has this group of 400 men, but they are still fearful. So David went from there to Mizpah in Moab. And he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and my mother stay with you until I know what God will do for me. So David knows that he is not in control of this situation. He doesn't know what is going to happen, but he is confident that God is going to do something for him. But he doesn't know really what what form that's going to take. And so he chooses to take his mother and his father, who at this point are likely very old people, and he takes them to their homeland, basically. They're half Moabite and half, or not half and half, but they have their ancestry linked directly back to Moab, where their, I believe his great-great-grandmother Ruth would have come from. So they have family lineage that goes back to Moab. So he takes his mother and his father and takes him to the king, and he leaves them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. And then the prophet Gad said to David, "Do not remain in the stronghold, depart and go into the land of Judah." So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. And by extension, it doesn't say this, but his men also went with him. They're, a band that moves together at this point. So we're going to be seeing in here a few different places that David is going to be inquiring of the Lord, and that the Lord is going to tell him to do certain things. And so at this point, this prophet Gad has just kind of dropped onto the scene. This is the first thing that we hear about him, and we're going to hear more about him later on. But so David has got a prophet in his midst, and he is soon to have a priest in his midst as well, with the garments of the priesthood with which they can inquire of the Lord. And so David is well equipped with spiritual men to help him lead all of these other men to success. So verse 6 says, Saul heard that David was discovered, and the men who were with him. Saul was sitting at Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand, and all of his servants were standing about him. And Saul said to his servants who stood about him, "Hear now, you people of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards, and will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? That all of you have conspired against me. No one disclosed to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse, and none of you is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait at this day." So this is a good example of just because somebody says something in the Bible does not mean that it's true. Saul is at this point, he's basically gone out of his mind. He is suspicious of everyone around him. And we get some insight into the way that Saul has been running his kingdom up to this point. He is a son of Benjamin, and he is surrounded by men who are of every tribe of Israel. It tells us that when he was, inaugurated king, men from every tribe of Israel stayed with him, men that God had put it on their hearts to be with him. But he here is specifically addressing the men of Benjamin. He's addressing his brethren. And by extension, he's saying, I have given you vineyards, I've made you commanders, I've made you, or given you fields. In other words, he has favored the men of his tribe over all of the other tribes of Israel, which, for anyone who is in a position of leadership over an entire country, that's a really terrible idea. That would be like the president of the United States, say George Bush from Texas, only giving things to Texans and only taking care of people in Texas because he's from Texas, right? Well, then, if he is needing support from anywhere else in the country, that's going to become a problem for him. So, Saul has basically, corrupted his power as a king, not only spiritually, but also, also physically. And so he's pointing out, since David is a man of the tribe of Judah, he's not going to be giving you Benjaminites all the stuff that I've been giving you. Saul obviously believes that since he is corrupt, everyone else is corrupt. I don't think that's true, obviously, but so he's kind of calling out his guys and saying, hey, I've given you all of these things, and you should have had my back. That's why I gave you this stuff, right? You should have had my back. None of you is sorry for me. And then he goes into this made up kind of pity party about his son inciting David against him, where absolutely none of that is true. There's no evidence of that other than the fact that David and Jonathan do have a covenant with one another to protect one another. And Jonathan was watching out for the life of David. But, Saul has taken the truth of the situation and made it so much more than it is in his mind. So he is upset with his guys of Benjamin because they have not, they haven't had his back the way that he wanted him to. But in verse 9, we have this guy Doeg, the Edomite. Doeg means, fearful, kind of like a dog. That's basically what it means. So he speaks up, and he said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub, And he inquired of the Lord for him and gave him provisions and gave him the sword of Goliath of the Philistine. So, we knew when that guy was there that it was going to be a trouble. David knew it as well. We do know specifically that that Ahimelech did give David provisions, and he did give him the sword of Goliath the Philistine, but we're actually not told at all that he inquired of the Lord for him. Some people look at that and point out that, even this guy Doeg is, he was detained before the Lord in Nob. We don't really know exactly what that means, but it seems like he probably has kind of an adversarial relationship with the priesthood. There was something not fun for him going on there with him. So it seems like he might be kind of exaggerating and trying to make what they did sound worse than it actually was because he wants harm to come to them. Or on the other hand, maybe the priest did inquire of God for David and it just doesn't tell us. We don't really know. But so he gives those three things. He inquired of the Lord, gave him provisions, and gave him a sword. And so the king sent to summon Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all of his father's house, the priests who were at Nob, and all of them came to the king. And Saul said, "Hear now the son of Ahitub." So Saul has brought them into his presence. This is, depending on the route that they take from Nob to Gibeah, where Saul is between like a 2 to 3 mile walk. So it's, maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours for this whole procession of 85 men to come from the city of the priests in Nob and to come to Saul. So there's an interesting thing happening here that can be a challenge to look at for Christians. So Ahimelech and Ahitub are the direct lineal descendants of Eli. I don't know if y'all remember, but Eli was the high priest of Israel, and his 2 sons were priests under him. He honored his sons over God, and so God put his sons to death in battle. And then Eli falls over backwards in his chair and dies. But as a part of that, God told him that your line as priests will end, and you will no longer have an old man in your house. And so, interestingly, as this happened, one of the wives of one of Eli's sons was pregnant, and she gave birth and had a son. That son is Ahitub. And so we have this straight lineal descent that is actually broadened into 85 men that are, old enough to wear the linen ephod. And so what is going to happen here is, it's interesting because God has cursed, he has put a curse upon the line of Eli. He said, you will no longer have an old man in your house because of what you've done, and that they would not any longer be the priestly line for the Lord. So it's kind of an interesting thing to look at, that, that we have an evil that is about to happen here, but it is an evil that, interestingly, the Lord foretold it. It was something that the Lord knew was going to happen. So the king sent and summoned them. They came all to him, and Saul said, "Hear now the son of Ahitub." And he answered, "Here I am, my lord." And Saul said to him, "Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword and have inquired of God for him, so that he has risen against me to lie in wait as to this day?" Then Ahimelech answered the king, "And who among all of your servants is so faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law and a captain over your bodyguard and honored in your house?" So he is beginning his defense. Basically, why would I have suspected that there was a problem with David? He is honored in your household. "Is today the first time that I have inquired of God for him? No, let not the king impute anything to his servant or all of the house of my father, for your servant has known nothing of all this, much or little." And the king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and your father's house." And the king said to the guard who stood about him, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand is with David." And they knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me. But the servants of the king would not put out their hand to strike the priests of the Lord. So these men who are at the side of Saul have what I would call a healthy and proper fear of the Lord. They are not going to raise their hand against those who are the anointed of the Lord. So it's kind of cool to see, even in the midst of this kind corruption that these guys are living in and seeing every day, they still have the ability to discern right from wrong. And when they are told by their king, who I guarantee before this time has ordered them to kill many other people, they are able to discern right and wrong. And in this time where, we could look at it and say, they were ordered by their commanding officer to do this, so shouldn't they have just done it? Well, this clearly shows that there is a time for everyone to stand up against what they know is wrong and against what is an evil order. And to, what these guys are doing is called practicing civil disobedience against their king. They are choosing to disobey an order rather than to obey an order that leads to evil. So the king turns to Doeg. Doeg is not of the people of Israel. He is an Edomite. He is a Gentile, and clearly is, he's an evil man. So he turns to him and says, "You strike the priests." And Doeg the Edomite turned and struck down the priests, and he killed on that day 85 persons who wore the linen ephod. So that means 85 men. Men wear the ephod, and as we saw with Samuel himself, a young boy who has been dedicated to the service of the Lord can also wear an ephod, but the general age in which a young man would go and wear a linen ephod is 20 years old. So, going back to the book of Exodus. So, there's this family is kind of expanded very quickly, and there's 85 men who have come from the city of Nob to Gibeah, where Saul is, surrounded by the army. And evidently, as I've kind of looked into this one man spent, I don't even know how long it would take to with a sword turn and kill 85 men. But it's kind of one of those things that you don't even want to contemplate what that would have been like. But 85 of the men were killed. And verse 19 says, "And Nob, the city of the priests, he put to sword, both man and woman, child, infant, ox, donkey, and sheep he put to the sword." So it's striking that Saul is taken such a terrible turn at this point. He was instructed by the Lord among the Amalekites to destroy every man, woman, child, every ox, donkey, and sheep. That was the instruction that Saul had from the Lord with the Amalekites, the people who he was to put to complete destruction. And so Saul has done now, I believe, a complete 180 and has completely turned his back on the Lord at this point. He is, I don't think there's any doubt that this is the absolute worst thing that we have recorded that Saul does in his entire time as king. And he has taken the instruction that the Lord gave him with the Amalekites and turned it and perverted it to destroy the priestly line of God. But as always, God spares a remnant. One of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. So he knows that if Saul is his enemy, the place to flee to is David. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. And David said to Abiathar, "I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, 'I have occasioned the death of all the persons in your father's house. Stay with me, do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life also seeks your life. So with me you shall be in safekeeping.'" So David, taking serious responsibility for what has happened here. It can easily be argued David did not kill any of these people. David did not raise a sword against any of them. He did not give the order that put them to death. But he does realize that his actions and, in some circumstance, the lie that he told to the priest while he was there put the whole priestly line in jeopardy. And so he feels responsible for all of their deaths. Now, this is, another one of those places that you see just such a different heart from Saul, where David not only is just taking responsibility for his actions, but is even taking responsibility for something that he didn't have control over and is still grieved over it and is still has the heart to do what he can to make it right. So he encourages this priest to stay with him. And I love how he ends this. He says, "With me you shall be in safekeeping." To me, that speaks to David's faith and assurance of the promises that God has given to him. Basically, I know that I'm safe. Even though these bad things are befalling me, I know that I will be safe. So if you stay with me, you'll be safe as well. So they, don't know who they is. It's either David's men or maybe some runners or travelers possibly. They told David, "Behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah, and they are robbing the threshing floors." So the Philistines are, they're just opportunistic, and they know how to really stick it to people when they're down. They've already, been oppressing the Israelites for decades at this point. And what they're doing here is allowing the Israelites to plant grain, to cultivate it, let it grow to maturity, harvest it, and stack it on the threshing floors. And even potentially the grain has already been threshed out. They've let them do all of the work. And while they are vulnerable there without a great way to protect their harvest, they come and they raid, they kill the people who are there, and they steal it. So David inquired of the Lord, which again was either through the prophet Gad or through Abiathar the priest. And he says, "Shall I go attack these Philistines?" And the Lord said to David, "Go attack the Philistines and save Keilah." But David's men said to him, "Behold, we were afraid here in Judah. How much more than if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines?" So again, these guys are, farmers or, garbage collectors or, we don't know what they were, what they did, but they were not men of valor and men of war. What we're about to see here is likely going to be their first engagement with an army. And so they're like, "Hey, we're already in a cave hiding because we're scared here." Or, in the forest hiding or wherever they were. We really don't want to go fight against the armies of the Philistines. And so interestingly, David, he doesn't just pull rank on them or try to, coerce half of the army into making the other half of the army go or whatever. He goes back and again inquires of the Lord. And the Lord answers him, "Arise and go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand." So he gets a different and more complete answer from the Lord in this circumstance. The first time that he inquired of him, he just asks, whether you should go to war. And he doesn't ask whether they will have success or not. But the second time, the Lord reassures him and says, "You will have success. I will give the Philistines into your hand." And so evidently David tells his men this, or maybe they were even there and heard it when it happened. I don't know. But they seemingly have a boost in confidence, and they go down to Keilah. They fight the Philistines. They bring away the Philistines' livestock and struck them with a great blow, so that David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. And when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, had fled to David to Keilah, he came down with the ephod in his hand. Now that is kind of a verse that was stuck in there, I think, to kind of let us know how it is that David is communicating with the Lord in this circumstance. So it was told to Saul that David had come to Keilah, and Saul said, "God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars." So it is evident that Saul is just self-deluded at this point, that even though he knows that he has expressly gone against the Lord, and he has rebelled against the Lord, and the Lord has rejected him as king, he still believes that the Lord is on his side in trying to kill David. So Saul is, from this point forward, going to be hunting David. It says every day. So he wants to go down with his army and destroy David and his men who have just saved this city out of the hand of the Philistines. It's interesting that the Lord doesn't tell us that David helped them or David supported them or David fought alongside of them. It says David saved them. It's a very specific language that is used. God used David and his men as an instrument to save these people. And all that Saul can think about is still going and destroying his enemy. So somebody probably somebody from the city goes and tells Saul that David was in this town. And so Saul rejoices and thinks that the Lord is on his side. And so Saul summons all the people to war to go down to Keilah and besiege David and his men. So David knew that Saul was plotting harm against him, and he said to Abiathar the priest, "Bring the ephod here." And David said, "O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down, as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, please tell your servant." And the Lord said, "He will come down." So David's inquiries of the Lord are becoming a little bit more distressed at this point. And he knows, evidently, obviously, that his presence there is putting the people of this city who have just dealt with an attack and potentially a siege, he's putting them in even more danger from the king, who is apparently willing to come and destroy a whole city just to get at David. And so David's asking the Lord, like, hey, is Saul coming? And the Lord answers that part of the question. And he also answers him, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will surely surrender you. Now, it's an interesting thing to look at. I guess it's really easy to look at it from our perspective and think how crappy that is that the people of Keilah would give up the guy and his men who just saved them from these people. But at the same time, I think as like a father, how I would have to react if me and my wife and children were in this city and, we saw another army coming to approach us, that we've just survived the last one. And all that you have to do to survive is to give up this man who has been, touted as a criminal, to give him up to the king who is coming to arrest him. And so, it's really easy from my perspective to sit in judgment over those people. But I think it may be worth looking at it from both sides and thinking about what did these people really know? What information did they have? But it is important to know, though, that they are Israelites. This town of Keilah is in Israel, and they are Jewish people. They're not Philistines. They're not Gentiles. They are people of God. And so Saul is their king. Even to this point, as far as they know, Saul is their king. So the Lord kind of assures him they are going to surrender you. It's pretty cool in reading this that God knows the future. He knows exactly what is going to happen. But what I think is even more kind of interesting, as I was reading about this, I learned from another pastor who was teaching this, that God not only knows what is going to happen, but he also knows what is going to happen if a different course of events takes place. So, it's really easy to know that God knows that David is going to escape safely, right? But God also knows that if David stays there, that the men of this city are going to surrender him to the people. It's honestly, for me, when I read that, it was a whole nother level of God's foreknowledge that I hadn't even thought about. That God knows not only the things that will happen, but the things that would happen if things happened in a different way. It's kind of like, it was mind-blowing for me thinking about that, even trying to understand how that works. But so God doesn't say, well, I think that if you stay, they'll probably give you up. That's not what God says. He says, if you stay, they will surrender you. And so David and his men, who were about 600, arose and departed from Keilah. Now, it's interesting to see it seems like David has gained some men, right? In this last engagement, I don't know whether it's men of the city who no longer have families, or men who feel they're no longer safe there, or obviously men that could have joined him just since the last time we got a numbering. But David's army has grown by 50% since the last time we heard about him. So him and his 600 men depart from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. So they kind of just disperse at this point. When Saul was told that David escaped from Keilah, he gave up the expedition, and David remained in the strongholds in the wilderness, in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph, and Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into his hand. So David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh, and Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. Now that's a great saying. I would love to be somebody who is spoken of somebody that strengthens somebody else's hand in God, right? What does that mean? That means that he just went there and he encouraged David. He reminded him of the promises that God had made for him. He reminded him of the power of God. He reminded him, I'm sure, of the love that was between the two of them. And he goes not to complain, not to ask for help, not anything else. He goes to strengthen his hand. And so he says to him, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Saul my father also knows this." Now that is really interesting, right? As we kind of look into the dynamics of this relationship between David and Jonathan, Jonathan and his father Saul, Saul and David, there's like really a triangle of personalities that are happening here. There's kind of split opinion on what this means. Some scholars and Jewish rabbis believe that Saul was given a vision by the Lord in the time that he was forced to prophesy by the Holy Spirit that David would be king over Israel. Or it could just be that, the Saul, seeing the course of events, it's been impressed on his heart that he just knows that David is going to be the king. But there's a whole nother interesting thing beyond that Jonathan says that, that I will be next to you. So Jonathan is expressing his heart towards David that, like, I know that I'm not going to be king. Jonathan, whatever kind of humility and lack of pride and peace that he's found, it's pretty profound, but he knows, regardless of what happens, he knows that he is not going to be king. He knows that David has sworn an oath to him and to his household to not persecute him. And so as far as he knows at this point, there isn't anything standing between him and David and a future together. He doesn't know that he'll be dying on a battlefield with his father. And it is his heart to just stand beside David as his general or as his advisor, as the commander of his army, whatever that looks like. But he wants to be next to him, and his father Saul also knows it. I think he is saying that he knows that Jonathan's heart is with David. He knows that Jonathan is not going to be king, and he knows that David is going to be king. So the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. This is a renewal of their covenant and seemingly a covenant of their, relationship that they would have when David becomes king. As David remained at Horesh and Jonathan went home. Then the Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeah saying, "Is not David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horesh in the hill of Hachilah, which is in Jeshimon? Now come down, O king, according to all your heart's desire to come down, and our part shall be to surrender him into the king's hand." And Saul said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, for you have found compassion on me." So Saul, this word compassion is really funny that he's using here. He has created a narrative in his own mind of being the one who is persecuted in this situation. And he feels that these people who are betraying David, who has done nothing wrong, are finding compassion for what David has done to him, which, as we know, is nothing. He says, "Go make yet more sure. Know and see the place where his foot is and who has seen him there, for it is told to me that he is very cunning. See therefore and take note of all the lurking places where he hides, and come back to me with sure information. Then I will go to you, and if he is in the land, I will search him out among the thousands of Judah." And they arose and went to Ziph ahead of Saul. Now David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon in the Arabah to the south of Jeshimon. And Saul and his men went to seek him. And David was told, so he went down to the rock and lived in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued David in the wilderness of Maon. Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men went on the other side of the mountain. And David was hurrying to get away from Saul. And as Saul and his men were closing in on David, as Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them, a messenger came to Saul saying, "Hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land." So Saul has got a decent-sized army with him, and I've heard two different versions of this, and I really don't know which it is. I've kind of tried to do some Google Maps figuring it out, but I couldn't figure it out before I had to come and do this today. So some people say that on this mountain that they're talking about, there is a ravine that is impassable, but that you can walk around it to either end. And so that David put himself on one side of this, knowing which direction the king was coming, so that he could see the approach of the king and his army, and whichever way the king and his army went, David could just go around the other way, and they could just chase each other around this ravine. And then the opposite that I heard of that is it's the same situation except with a mountain, that they couldn't see each other, but they were essentially chasing each other around a hill. I could not figure out which one of those is accurate for the situation, but I kind of tend to think that it's a hill because it's going to name the rock where they were. So either way, they're playing kind of a funny game of chasing each other around this situation. And more than likely, they would have got to the point where Saul just splits his army and sends half of them either way to go catch him. But as they are in this situation, they have a runner come and say that the Philistines have made a raid against the land. Now, this is a likely example of God using his enemies as a tool to save, the righteous man that he is working to save. He very likely, in whatever way that he does, incited the Philistines to come and attack Israel so that Saul would be drawn away from this situation. So Saul returned from pursuing after David and went against the Philistines. Therefore, that place was called the Rock of Escape. And David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-gedi. So when Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi." So Saul has either got a really impressive group of spies going on, or he has either got the people, he's incentivized the people of the land, whether it's through fear or through bribes or through whatever, to let him know where David and his men are. Because this whole story, back and forth, we see wherever David is, somebody is going to tell Saul where he is. So he goes and tells him where he is, and Saul took 3,000 chosen men of Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the Wild Goats Rocks. So evidently in this place in Israel, from the time that we're reading about now all the way to this present day, there's been a stable population of ibex goats that live in this area. And, that's a 3,000 year period between then and now. And you can still go to this same area today and see this same population of these ibex goats that lived here in this time. So it's a really rugged and rocky situation. And so Saul has basically taken 3,000 of his men to go and spread out and just comb the whole area like they're hunting ibex, basically. They're going hunting. And so he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. So it's interesting in this area. I know that we've talked more than once about how bright the sun is in the Middle East during the day. It's an incredibly, incredibly bright sun, and they didn't have any hats or sunglasses at the time. So if you're standing outside of a cave looking in, you would not be able to see anything. Whereas dark, you wouldn't be able to see anything. But these guys who are inside the cave looking out would be able to see anything that's going on outside there, right? So Saul seems to choose this totally random cave. It seems like coincidence, right? But it's clearly not. So he goes into this cave in order to, I like the way the King James puts it. It says he goes in to cover his feet. So he goes into this cave to relieve himself, and David and his men are in the innermost part of the cave. And the men of David said to him, "Here is the day of which the Lord has said to you, behold, I will give your enemies into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you." So these guys are stoked. They are excited about this because, I would say they're probably tired of living in caves at this point. And, Saul is not just the enemy of David. All of these men who have come around David are around him because Saul has either directly or indirectly, through the conditions he's created in the kingdom, alienated these people to the point they have to flee into the wilderness. So I'm sure there's nothing they would like to see more than Saul killed. And so they look at it and say, "Hey, God said you're going to be king, and God said that he'll deliver your enemies into your hands. Now is your chance. There's no way this is a coincidence. It's interesting to see multiple times throughout the Old Testament with the forefathers, God makes a promise that something will come about, but he doesn't necessarily say exactly how he is going to do it. Whether we look at David and the kingship, or whether we look at, Jacob and the promise that God gave him that that the older would serve the younger, or, Abraham, God promising him to have a son. And it seems like it is always the temptation of man when there is a promise to look for opportunities for us to help God fulfill the promise for us, right? With Abraham, he looks at his wife and says, if you were going to have a baby, you would have had one by now. So, or really his wife said it. So let's have a baby with our servant. At that point, God had promised a son to Abraham, but he had not said that it would be through Sarah. That comes later after the son of the flesh is born. And, with Jacob, he knows that he's been given the promise of God that the older would serve the younger, but him and his mother concoct a scheme to steal the birthright or the blessing from his brother. And so David is around some guys right now that are like, hey, you could definitely help God bring all of this to a conclusion right now if you wanted to. But David has a reverence for a man who was once the anointed one of God. Now, I'm not even necessarily saying that God didn't deliver Saul into David's hand. I don't know. This may have been kind of a test to see what kind of heart that David has. And in fact, if David would have taken the life of Saul, I'm not even convinced in my own heart that it would have been a sin, that would have been wrong. It would have been self-defense, really. But what we see here is a playing out of David's faith that God is going to bring his promises to fulfillment and that David doesn't have to hasten them himself. So the guys are like, hey, God has definitely brought him here so that you could do this. So David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. So what that means is that David arose from where he was with his sword in his hand. He was approaching the king with his sword, and there had to have been something going through his head as he's doing this. What is the promises that the Lord has given me? Is it right for me to do this? And as he approaches him, he clearly decides that he is not going to take the life of the king, but he cuts off the corner of his robe. And he says to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, talking of Saul, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing that he is the Lord's anointed. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. Now, these guys must be better at whispering than I am, because my wife and I will try and have a whispered conversation. It just does not work. I can't hear what she's saying. I don't whisper well, but these guys are in a silent cave, evidently, with Saul in there relieving himself, and they're having this whispered confrontation about whether or not they should go kill the guy. And evidently Saul does not feel or hear David cut off his robe. So he must have had a really, really sharp sword, and he doesn't hear this argument that's going on between David and his men. But after he leaves the cave, David also arose and went out of the cave, and he calls after Saul, "My lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks your harm'? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave, and some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand, for by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you, and may the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you." So David has made a commitment that regardless of what Saul does to him, because Saul is the anointed of the Lord, David's hand will not be against him. And of all of the mistakes that David makes, he always keeps this oath his entire life. And in fact, when a man comes forward claiming to have been the one who kills King Saul, he has that man put to death for killing the Lord's anointed. David is true to his word with the king all the way to death. So he says, verse 13, as the proverb of the ancients say, out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog, after a flea? May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. And as soon as David had finished speaking the words to Saul, Saul said, is this your voice, my son David? And David lifted up his voice and wept. And he said to David, you are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. You have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now, behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up again to the stronghold. So we have an interesting response from Saul in this situation. And Saul is a man who is clearly led by his feelings and by his emotions, but not by a true repentance. We are told that there is a fleshly repentance that leads to death, but a true righteous repentance that leads to life. And Saul is, he's engaging in a fleshly repentance here. He is clearly has a shallow depth of emotion and is just led by that emotion wherever he goes. But it's important to remember that repentance means not saying that you are sorry, but it is a changing of the mind and a changing of direction. So the words that Saul is speaking here really don't matter, because the actions that he is going to display from this point forward are continuing towards death. He's going to continue trying to kill David. So we are going to wrap up there. That's going to, I actually made 3 chapters tonight, so I'm pretty happy about that. But we are, just constantly confronted as David is on the rise now in his power with a contrasting difference between the character of David and Saul. A man who is after God's own heart and a man who's after his own heart. So, Lord, just pray that you would continue to impress these things on our hearts, that we would have confidence in the promises that you make towards us, that we would be faithful in the things that you ask us to do, and that you would just give us confidence and joy in the promises that you make to us. And Lord, I just pray that you would bring us back together again safely next week, that you would watch over Miss Donna and Mr. Eddie as they're going on their trip, and also for Mr. Eric tonight, I pray that you would continue healing his body, Lord, that the effects of this sickness that he is dealing with would go away quickly, and this would not be an issue that continues happening with him. Amen.